No, is that it? Okay, got it.
Got it.
Take it away, Charlie.
Okay. Being, I guess, a naturalist, I have had for a long time an interest in the history of natural history, and being at Cornell, it's focused on Cornell over the end of the 19th and through the end of the 20th century. And it's a selection of folks whose works I knew, and in some cases, and at least one or two, I knew the people involved personally. And I would imagine that some of you either took classes from these people or might also have known them personally otherwise. So I'm going to start with a brief digression, though. It's as I drive around Tompkins County and the Finger Lakes, I sometimes see things that capture my imagination. And I was over in the town of Caroline a few days ago studying wildflowers, and this caught my attention. I sort of speaks to a problem we have around the county, and that nobody pays much attention to the speed limits. And I thought these folks had at least started a movement that might do something about it. My wife and I stopped. I took the picture, and she almost fell out of the car laughing. She thought that was entertaining. So this is Caroline, I suppose, humor. Okay, now down to the real stuff. I've picked just a few of the Cornell naturalists of the 19th and 20th century. I've probably overlooked some, and if I've overlooked your favorite naturalist, I apologize for it. But these are folks whom I've had at least contact with in the literature over much of my career, and in some cases, as I'll explain, I actually knew or worked with some of them. I arrived at Cornell about 20 years too late, actually, to be able to benefit from the teachings of many of the people I profile. And it begins in the beginning on the convocation, the first convocation at Cornell. Louis Agassiz, who's a Swiss geologist, spoke, and then followed that with 20 guest lectures on zoology. It's reported that A.D. White wanted him to come to Cornell. He was at Harvard, and I think he preferred the city to the country, because as soon as he finished his lectures during that semester, it's reported he went back to Boston before winter started. And he, right after that, founded the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, which is a distinguished museum of natural history. Oh, I'll go back just a moment. Agassiz also did something while he was in Switzerland as a geologist. He demonstrated that glaciers moved, and he did this simply by putting some wooden posts across a glacier and noting that the posts in the middle of the glacier actually moved downward as the glacier flowed very, very slowly over the course of a year or two. And one of my favorites, whose paintings of birds, I think, are easily the best in North America. Louis Furties, his father, was the founder of the College of Civil and Engineering at Cornell. Estevan Furties, the Furties Stellar Observatory on North Campus, is named for Estevan Furties, not Louis Agassiz Furties, an ornithologist and an artist, and a graduate of Cornell, the Cornell class of 1897. And he was remarkable in his period. He paid attention to what scientists were talking about, and one of the things that was of interest in the late 19th and early 20th century, put forth actually by some of the artists in the Hudson River School at that time, was the idea of protective coloration or camouflage. And Furties actually did that with his paintings, painting of a white-tailed ptarmigan on the left in summer, and in winter, these birds change their plumage colors depending on the season. If you didn't see the birds in summer, there they are. The female is particularly well camouflaged. And so Furties not only was an observer of birds, I think he was more than that, an observer of birds in their natural habitats, and he typically painted birds in their natural habitats. And if you visit the lecture hall at the Laboratory of Ornithology, if it reopens and if it's unlocked, you can see these images on the wall around the lecture hall. They were donated to Cornell. They're just beautiful. And of course, Liberty Hyde Bailey, a botanist primarily, but also dean of the College of Agriculture in the early 20th century for 10 years, which was a pretty long tenure as dean. And he was a specialist in the studies of palms. This is Christmas palm. I don't know if he studied that or not, but he and his wife traveled together all over the world to study palms. And remarkably, he developed a technique for storing them in herbaria, which can be a challenge if you look at the size of these. But there are many of his specimens in the Cornell herbarium. John Henry Comstock, for whom Comstock Hall is named, an entomologist. He was in the first graduating class at Cornell in 1872 and was asked while he was there by the students in the class to teach them a course in entomology. So he was well ahead of his time, and he was hired at Cornell. He didn't earn a PhD, he had a master's degree from Cornell, and in 1880 founded the Department of Entomology at Cornell, the first entomology department in the Western Hemisphere in 1880. He also created this lovely little tray down on the bottom right, which has the name, the Cornell insect tray. It's actually a museum tray. And if you go over to Comstock Hall, I think they might still have his desk there. And his desk was made so that he had a series of spaces on the right side, I believe, into which he easily could slide these drawers so that he put away the specimens he might be studying at the time and had an easy way to get to them and study them later. Remarkable person. And he and his wife were a team indeed. Anna Botsford Comstock, the science educator, published her Handbook of Nature Study in 1911, used by educators all around the country, and in New York State founded the bulletins or pamphlets that were part of the extension publications in those days, distributed to the schools with nature studies subjects. And Vern Rockcastle in the education department revised and updated the Handbook of Nature Study in 1986. It's still got useful and accurate information in it, though the names of plants and animals have changed over time. And this guy was truly remarkable. David Starr Jordan was in the first graduating class, 1872. He and his colleagues actually created a camp behind the AD White House, and they banded together and called themselves the Struggle for Survival. And that's where they lived and ate and slept. I'm not sure the president was very enamored of that concept, but they persisted. He went on to be an administrator at Indiana University and was the first chancellor of Stanford University. And his 4-volume work, The Fishes of North and Middle America, is still used and useful. If you look at this, it was published from 1896 to 1900, and Dr. Jordan was 24 years old at the time it started. So he was working on this early in his career and indeed contributed to ichthyology throughout his career, the study of fishes. And NOAA has a research vessel, the David Starr Jordan, that's named for him. And a salamander is named for him. It's a patronym, what they call a patronym, named to recognize and show the appreciation for someone's contributions to science. And it's Plethodon jordani, and only found in the Smoky Mountains National Park, found no place else in the world. And I've seen it in the field, and this is one of my photographs, a beautiful, beautiful little salamander. Albert Hazen Wright actually was the mentor for a number of 20th century PhDs. He got his PhD from Cornell, from Burt Green Wilder in 1908. There's very few pictures of Albert Hazen Wright on the web. I managed to find a couple, one probably on the left when he was a student or professor at Cornell. Yeah, that's when he was a professor at Cornell, and then later in life. He and his wife, like the Comstocks, were a team. His wife did most of the photographic work for him when they were in the field. And she was Arthur Allen's sister. And the Handbooks of Nature Study were a classic publication of Cornell Press under Comstock Press Association in those days. So the earliest field guide, if you will, though it's a very large book for a field guide in both cases, was his Handbook of Frogs and Toads, and then followed before he retired of his Handbook of Snakes of the US and Canada. Arthur Allen and Paul Kellogg were both ornithologists. Allen got his degree in 1915. He studied red-winged blackbirds in the marshlands that we now call the high school and junior high school or middle school in Ithaca. So they were all filled in after his studies. In his thesis, he has some photographs looking from West Hill down onto the marsh that he studied, where the schools are located now. Paul Kellogg earned his PhD from Allen in 1928, and he pioneered in the recording of bird sounds. And my very first introduction to Cornell was a loan from a mentor of mine of the little LP records that were the sound recordings of birds that were a audio field guide to identification of bird sounds. And I hadn't known at the time, I was probably 12 years, 15 years, maybe old at the time, that you really could identify birds by their songs and calls. And since I've learned that, I've gotten very lazy about seeing songbirds. I prefer to hear them and identify them. It's a lot easier. And then while I'm listening for birds, I can look for wildflowers and plants. I was very fortunate. One of the most fortunate experiences of my graduate career was to have a summer where I had no funding for staying at Cornell. And a good friend of mine said, well, go talk to Paul Kellogg at Lab of Ornithology. He's teaching a course this summer and you might be able to help him. And presumptuous as I was at the time, I went out to the lab and arranged an appointment with Paul Kellogg and was interviewed for the course. And he asked me if I knew anything about bird sounds. And I told him, yes, based on listening to your record, I know about 95% of what I hear. And he said, that's good enough. You can be my assistant. And we started the first of the Cornell Adult University courses for adults in the study of birds. And I was privileged to work with Paul for about 4 years, including 1972. A remarkable person, great sense of humor. He wasn't an engineer, but he had an engineer's approach to the study of birds, which of course led to his sound recording interest. And I remember that over that period, Hewlett-Packard introduced the first pocket calculator, and he was excited about that. He said, look here, he said, I can take the logarithm of this number in a matter of seconds. And he was really enamored of technology. This fellow was an odontologist and a limnologist at Cornell. And let me tell you a little bit about what that is. James J. Needham. Odontologists study dragonflies and damselflies, these little insects that flit around over wetlands and sometimes more inland, where they catch other insects and eat them on the wing. And they're delightful insects. I've spent some time studying at least the ones that are easy to identify, the ones like the common whitetail and then the ebony jewelwing down in the bottom right. I grew up with the ebony jewelwing as a kid. There was a creek that ran through our front yard and I watched them there, and my grandmother called them snake feeders. That was part of the mythology. Either they were fed upon by snakes, which is more likely, or they themselves fed snakes. They probably are fed upon by snakes occasionally. And in a more technical way, John Henry Comstock and James Needham created a system for naming insect wing veins that's still used now for any insects that have wings that have veins in them, to help you identify them and key them out when you have them in a museum. Another one of the distinguished naturalists at Cornell, and many of you perhaps knew Bill Hamilton, sometimes known as Wild Bill Hamilton. He was in the Department of Conservation at Cornell, later Natural Resources, had retired for the time I arrived in 1970, but was still visiting the department from time to time. One of my undergraduates did his honors thesis on Bill Hamilton's humor, and he was a prankster as well as a mammalogist. And I'll tell you a little story about Bill that I experienced when I worked at the Laboratory of Ornithology in the 80s. I was there on Sunday morning working in my office because the weekends on Sunday mornings especially usually were pretty quiet. And we had a receptionist at the front desk who was, I suppose, maybe a bunny hugger and a little bit excitable at times. And the quietness of my office was interrupted by this young woman coming in almost screaming. She says, Charlie, Charlie, there's a crazy old man outside and he shot a deer in the sanctuary. I says, oh, really? So I walked out and here was a fellow standing about 6'10", bib overalls, shoes on with the sides cut out for his bunions, no socks. He had obviously been working in his flower garden that day. I recognized him. He knew me. I knew him. I walked up and I says, well, I hear you've got a deer in the sanctuary. He says, yeah. He says, you know, it's hunting season and I shot this buck, but I'm just too old to haul it out. Could you give me a hand with it? I said, why, sure, I'll do that. And to the secretary's astonishment, we walked out the front door. Bill turned to me and laughed. He said, Charlie, you think she knows anything about me? I said, Bill, I don't think so, but she'll remember you. That was one example of his practical jokes. And he was known to slip foldouts from Playboy magazine into his colleagues' lantern slides or slideshows when they were lecturing in class, among other things. The other story that I heard but didn't experience, he's had extension responsibilities and folks would come into Furneaux Hall with questions about rodents or bats or something like that. Bill's office was up on the second floor where my office was stationed later. And it's reported that a citizen came in with a dead mouse and was going to ask Bill what it was. And he was working and interrupted, of course, might have not been in the best of moods. And he looked at it and he said, oh, he said, yeah. I said, this is just a little white-footed mouse. And right before the person standing there, he said, you realize that they're poisonous. And the person had no idea. So he immediately pulled the skin back from the back of the animal. And you can do that if you want to, and took a bite out of it and fell out of his chair onto the floor convulsively. And the person went screaming down the stairs to the main office and said, the man up on the second floor just ate a mouse and he's dying. And of course, that got folks excited, though some were suspicious. And when they went back, Bill was still there working at his microscope as if nothing had happened at all. And so on. There are other tales of Bill Hamilton. They're equally entertaining, I think. Yeah. He also published the first guide to the mammals of the eastern United States. This is the second edition with John Whitaker, one of his students. And there was a third edition after Bill passed on that Whitaker was senior author for. But beautifully illustrated. Many of the illustrations in it were done by Louis Furtiz. So it was a start of the field guide series, well ahead of the field guides. Vladimir Nabokov at Cornell from 1948 to 1959. He was a biologist. He also wrote books, I'm told. I've not read any of them. One that seems to have captured a lot of attention in film and on books is Lolita. And this helped Vladimir Nabokov to retire. He wrote it while he was at Cornell, and he retired and went back to Switzerland, or went to Switzerland in 1959. And it's reported that the proceeds from the book Lolita, maybe even early film credits, provided him with all the income that he needed to study these little critters. He was an expert on the relationships, the naming, the taxonomy, the systematics of blue butterflies. These are little thumb-sized blue butterflies. We have a couple of species that show up here. These are a couple that I know from the Smoky Mountains, and he actually visited the Great Smoky Mountains National Park to study its blue butterflies in 1959. Nabokov never learned to drive. His wife Vera drove him in the summers all over the country to study blue butterflies. And I imagine she was rather patient about all of this. And a person I also knew and had the privilege of working with in Cornell's Adult University was Richard Fisher. He was a natural history educator for sure. In the field, he was just remarkable. I've never been in the field with anyone who shows his spark of enthusiasm, or did show the spark of enthusiasm and understanding of plants and animals that Dick Fisher had. And he easily communicated with younger audiences. Lesser known was his contribution to establishing what we call the New York returnable container legislation nowadays. He was very active in lobbying for that in Albany and eventually getting it passed. And he created, while he was on sabbatic leave with the National Wildlife Federation, the little magazine for young audiences called Ranger Rick. So he was a person of many talents, but a remarkable speaker, and even more remarkable to be out with in the field. And I worked with Dick Fisher for 4 or 5 years at the Adult University in the summer times. So curious naturalists. What is curiosity? Well, there it is. Desire to learn or know about anything, inquisitiveness. And eager to learn or know is a definition of curious either. And it applies in both contexts, either eager to learn or know, or maybe odd or strange as perceived by those normal folks around us sometimes. And then a naturalist, a fellow named Nichols, wrote a very nice article in Bioscience in 1992, based on his observations of his father, who was a naturalist and a teacher. He described a naturalist as a person whose curiosity is boundless. And I recently read a quote that was kind of interesting. It was, the cure for boredom is curiosity, and that there's no cure for curiosity. And that's a pretty well stated relationship of the two. And I pursued natural history studies as a naturalist and an evolutionary ecologist for all of my career, since I was probably 10 years or so old. And it's given me satisfaction wherever I can go in the world. I can look at plants and look at animals. And in travels to England a few years ago, I was particularly intrigued by the similarities. Indeed, some of the plants that we have here in this country now are identical to those in England and were probably brought here by some of the early settlers. One of my favorites in springtime is the English daisy, a little white flower that appears in lawns, particularly around Dryden and sometimes on campus. And of course, it's in the lawns that I saw when I was visiting England a few years ago. This is the last paragraph of the last page on the origin of species. Charles Darwin's father was a minister, I understand. And it's interesting how he leaves things for thinking that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms of life, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And it reflects a little bit of his understanding of nature and perhaps a little bit of his interaction with his father over time. I think that's it. I'll leave this question about what will the future bring for natural history studies at Cornell and elsewhere. Appalachian State University is a university now that I know somewhat that's one of the best schools for studies of field biology and natural history in the US at this time. Thank you. That's what I have, and I can try to answer some questions, or at least make up answers to questions.
Well done.
Nice, Charlie.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Charlie,
Yo,
what's the difference between a naturalist and a naturist?
clothing, I understand. When I was in Sweden with my wife, she cautioned me. Folks would ask me what I did for a living. I'd say I'm a naturalist, at which they became very interested. And she explained to me that the Swedes are naturists in some respects, and they are trying to figure out what you really do. So I just told them after that that I was a biologist.
Charlie, I got a question. Louis Agas's
Sure,
Freud,
please.
how did he get his first two names? Or did
His
actual
father was
name
Puerto
be-
Rican, came to the United States, ended up at Cornell as an engineer. And I imagine, though it's not written anywhere, that he was enamored by Louis Agassiz when he was here. And Fuertes was the family name. And it's not the folks that I've come in contact with at the Lab of Ornithology and other places want to call it Fuertes. And his daughter explained to me once upon a time, she was a teacher in the Ithaca system, that's Fuertes, as in fewer TEAS. So Louis Agassiz Fuertes, family name, and probably because his father liked Louis Agassiz. Best I can explain.
Charlie,
Yo,
there's a reference in there to Vern Rockcastle.
yes,
He's a friend of ours. I assume you know.
yes. A good educator and a good naturalist. I didn't know Vern well, and I didn't work with him. And but I know him. One of my good friends was one of his students for her master's degree and had high regard for Vern. He was particularly interested in elementary school education in the sciences broadly defined, mathematics, biology, other sciences, chemistry too.
He came into my lab whenever there was an eclipse, because my lab faced south and I had Venetian blinds, and
Oh,
little images of the sun all over the floor.
lovely. Yeah. Yeah, Vern was more interested, I understand, in the physical sciences than in the biological
Yeah,
sciences.
mainly.
Yeah.
He also was an avid skier,
Yes, cross country.
and he seemed to know all the places where you could ski when you were over 70 and ski for free if you were. And I tried to follow that as I got over 70, but they'd all canceled them. You had to pay then.
Oh my.
I remember him running past me. He must have been in his 80s. And he thumped his chest as he ran past. And he said, see, still fit and running.
Yeah.
Vern and I were fishing buddies,
Oh, wow.
and the best times we had were when we went to Alaska. Actually, there were 3 different trips to Alaska, and the worst trip I remember was when he took me night fishing.
Oh my gosh.
He knew what he knew what he was doing, and
Mhm.
I had no idea what was going on.
Yeah. His daughter still lives in Ithaca. She lives out near Ellis Hollow, and her husband is John Wiesinger, who's also a naturalist and a painter of birds too.
Yeah.
Very capable fellow.
Yep.
Hey,
Just down the street from me.
if
Okay.
you're after speakers, it sounds as if Fred could give a talk called Fishing in Alaska.
I think so.
It was quite a few years ago.
It doesn't matter. The fish are still there.
That's
Some,
right. We'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, the fish may not still be there for all we
the
know.
fish may not still be there. Okay. All right.
Yeah. No, that would be good, especially night fishing. We can all turn our lights off and imagine what it's like.
Yeah.
Close the blinds.
I'd be attentive to large furry critters up there at night, especially
Yeah.
really big animals.
Okay, well, thank you, Charlie, once again.
Jim, what you,
Oh, Jim, you're muted.
I was going to offer
Can't
that
hear you.
if
You're
Jim,
muted, Jim.
still muted. You're muted, you're muted, you're muted. And speaking away.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I have that Brinicle video as a speaking of natural wonders. If we have time,
I can hear what Jim was wanting
Now
to say.
Jim's unmuted now.
Yeah,
Right,
okay,
yeah.
I'll just finish this up. In talking about the sounds of birds, which bird has given you the most trouble during your career as far as identifying it?
By sound only?
Yes,
By sound only. Each, oh gosh, there's a group called warblers, the little colorful birds. And each year I really have to relearn their sounds a little bit. They just don't stick with me because, because I see them mostly in the spring. So I would say over the years, warblers as a group are challenging for me to relearn each spring.
thank
how
you.
many birds change their songs, rather like the humpback whales, Charlie?
Excuse me. Well, there's a lot of individual variation in bird
Yeah.
sounds, and there's a lot of regional variation. Excuse me. And there are regional dialects in birds. And so the call, I'm sorry, I'm not used to speaking this long these days since I retired. So I don't think we could say that bird sounds as they change function in the same way as we think that whale sounds function, but each bird has a repertoire, putting mockingbirds aside right now. and under different conditions will make different sounds. There's alarm notes for sure if there's a fox or a human or something like that, a hawk in the area. There are contact notes between male and female, and you hear these, or I hear them at least, when the birds are migrating at night. This time of year, you can identify the sounds they make, and they're maintaining contact with each other. All the noise that geese make are contact notes too when they're in flocks. So there's a whole repertoire, but it's more of a seasonal thing, and it's more of a contextual thing than global communications thing that we hear about in whales, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Any more for any more?
And Mark's going to run his Brinicle.
And Brian's definitely going to run his. Waiting for it.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you lots for your attention.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
Okay, may I share the screen, folks?
Please.
Okay, good.
It's 2 o'clock.
Yep.
Okay, you got it. That's the best part of that particular video. And
Stranger than fiction.
isn't it? Yeah. God, when I
Yeah.
came across that one, it was like Karen and I were just laughing and going, okay, I've got some great non-answers here. And the one that's most bizarre, the one that's the most bizarre is going to be the one that's the true answer. So yes, that was a lot of fun to put together.